In the silence of the desert, in the spaces beneath the golden sands, where time moves differently, in the hidden chambers that exist between the visible world and the invisible realms, there lies a temple so ancient, so carefully concealed, so deliberately hidden from the eyes of those who would seek to suppress its knowledge, that its very existence has been erased from human memory for thousands of years. This is the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, a sanctuary built not by human hands alone, but by the consciousness of women of extraordinary spiritual power, women who understood the nature of creation itself, women who worked to preserve the knowledge of the divine feminine when all the world was turning against it. This temple was not built as a monument to power or as a place of worship for distant gods, but was built as a living repository of consciousness, as a place where the Dragon Mothers could continue their sacred work of guiding the evolution of human awareness, as a sanctuary where the knowledge of the divine feminine could be preserved in its purest form, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to receive it. And what lies beneath the desert? What secrets are encoded in the very stones of this temple? What knowledge has been preserved in the chambers that exist between dimensions? Is a truth so profound, so transformative, so completely contrary to everything that patriarchal civilization has taught, that its revelation would fundamentally reshape human consciousness and human civilization? The story begins in a time so ancient that it exists more in the realm of consciousness than in the realm of historical fact. In this time, there were women of such extraordinary spiritual development, such profound understanding of the nature of consciousness and creation, that they were known as the Dragon Mothers. These were not ordinary women, but were beings who had awakened to their full potential, who had recognized themselves as expressions of the divine feminine consciousness, who possessed the power to perceive and shape reality through the force of their awakened awareness. The Dragon Mothers understood something that the patriarchal consciousness would eventually work desperately to suppress, that the divine feminine was not subordinate to the masculine, but was the primary principle from which all things emerged, the source of all creation, the consciousness that held all of existence within its infinite womb. They understood that the awakening of consciousness required the honoring and activation of the divine feminine principle, that the suppression of the feminine led to the fragmentation and limitation of consciousness, that the restoration of balance between masculine and feminine was essential for the evolution of human awareness. And so, the Dragon Mothers worked. They worked to establish communities in which the divine feminine was honored and celebrated. They worked to preserve the knowledge of the sacred mysteries. They worked to guide the evolution of human consciousness toward awakening and liberation. They worked to establish networks of priestesses and initiates who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. They worked with such dedication, such love, such unwavering commitment to the truth that they created structures of consciousness that would endure through the ages, that would survive the suppression and distortion that would come, that would eventually emerge to guide humanity toward its awakening. But as the patriarchal consciousness began to emerge, as systems of control began to be established, the Dragon Mothers understood that the time had come for them to go deeper underground, to create a sanctuary that would be hidden from the eyes of those who sought to suppress the knowledge of the divine feminine. And so they created the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, a sacred space that would exist beneath the desert, hidden from ordinary perception, accessible only to those who possess the consciousness and the knowledge to find it. The temple was built using principles of sacred geometry, using knowledge of the Earth's energy systems, using practices of consciousness that allowed the Dragon Mothers to work with dimensions of reality that were invisible to ordinary awareness. The temple was not built as a physical structure alone, but was built as a living consciousness, a place where the Dragon Mothers could continue their work, a sanctuary where the knowledge of the divine feminine could be preserved in its most concentrated form. Within the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, there were chambers dedicated to different aspects of the divine feminine consciousness. There was the Chamber of Creation, where the mysteries of how consciousness creates reality were preserved. There was the Chamber of Healing, where the knowledge of how to restore balance and wholeness to consciousness was maintained. There was the Chamber of Awakening, where the practices and disciplines that would facilitate the awakening of the dragon consciousness were preserved. There was the Chamber of Prophecy, where the knowledge of the future evolution of consciousness was held. And there were other chambers, other spaces, other repositories of knowledge that existed in dimensions that ordinary consciousness could not perceive. The Dragon Mothers established a lineage of priestesses who would maintain the temple, who would preserve the knowledge, who would continue the sacred work of guiding the evolution of human consciousness. They created initiation rituals that would prepare seekers for the reception of the deepest knowledge. They created sacred texts that encoded the knowledge in symbols and metaphors that would survive the centuries. They created a system of consciousness that would ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost, that it would be available when the time came for humanity to awaken. But as the patriarchal religions emerged and consolidated their power, the Dragon Mothers understood that the time of the temple's public revelation had passed. They understood that the knowledge would have to be hidden, that the temple would have to be concealed, that the priestesses would have to work in secret. And so they took steps to ensure that the temple would remain hidden, that it would be protected from those who sought to suppress the knowledge of the divine feminine, that it would be preserved for the time when humanity would be ready to receive it. The story of the recovery of the knowledge of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers in the modern world begins with a woman named Isis, a woman who carries within her the consciousness of the ancient priestesses, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Isis is a scholar, a mystic, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to the study of ancient mysteries, to the decoding of hidden symbols, to the understanding of the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of official history. Isis had always felt drawn to the desert, drawn to the mystery of what lay beneath the sands, drawn to the knowledge that something sacred had been hidden there. She had spent decades researching, studying ancient texts, following fragmentary clues, looking for evidence of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers. She had discovered references to the temple in the most ancient texts, references that had been deliberately obscured or suppressed, references that spoke of a sacred sanctuary hidden beneath the desert where the Dragon Mothers preserved the knowledge of the divine feminine. She had discovered that the temple was not a myth or a legend, but was a real place, a sanctuary that had been built by women of extraordinary consciousness, a place where the knowledge of the divine feminine had been preserved through the ages. She had discovered that the temple had been deliberately hidden, that its location had been encoded in symbols and sacred geometry, that it could only be found by those who possessed the consciousness and the knowledge to perceive it. It was during a deep meditation in the desert, a place where the veil between the visible and invisible world seemed particularly thin, that Isis received a vision that would change the course of her life. In this vision, she found herself standing before the entrance to the Temple of the Dragon Mothers. The temple appeared to her not as a physical structure, but as a living consciousness, a place of extraordinary beauty and power, a sanctuary where the Dragon Mothers themselves were present, working to guide the evolution of human consciousness. "You have been called," the Dragon Mother said to her, their voices resonating with the authority of ages and the tenderness of infinite love. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the consciousness of those who came before you, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the Temple of the Dragon Mothers to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand what lies beneath the desert, what knowledge has been preserved, what the Dragon Mothers have been working toward through the ages. And you have been prepared your entire life for this moment. Isis emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she had been given access to knowledge that had been hidden for thousands of years, knowledge that could reshape the entire understanding of human history and human spirituality. She understood that her role was to help reveal the truth about the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, to help humanity awaken to the reality that lay beneath the desert sands. She began to research with new urgency, using the clues she had been given in her vision, following the symbols that had been encoded in ancient texts, learning to perceive the energy signatures that would lead her to the temple. She discovered that the temple existed not only in the physical world, but also in dimensions of consciousness that were invisible to ordinary awareness. She discovered that the temple could be accessed through specific practices of meditation and consciousness cultivation. Through the awakening of the dragon consciousness within oneself, she discovered that the Temple of the Dragon Mothers was not a single physical location, but was a network of sacred spaces that existed both in the physical world and in dimensions of consciousness. She discovered that there were physical chambers beneath the desert that contained sacred texts and artifacts. But there were also chambers that existed in dimensions of consciousness, chambers that could only be accessed by those who had awakened to a certain level of awareness. She discovered that the Dragon Mothers had preserved the knowledge of how consciousness creates reality, how the divine feminine principle underlies all of creation, how the awakening of the dragon consciousness could transform individual consciousness and collective consciousness. She discovered that the knowledge preserved in the temple was not theoretical or abstract, but was practical knowledge that could be applied in one's own life, knowledge that could facilitate the awakening of consciousness, knowledge that could guide the transformation of human civilization. She discovered that the temple had been deliberately hidden, not to keep the knowledge from humanity, but to protect it, to ensure that it would not be distorted or suppressed, to preserve it in its purest form until the time when humanity would be ready to receive it. She discovered that the Dragon Mothers had been working through the ages to guide the evolution of human consciousness, that they had established networks of priestesses and initiates who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation, that they had ensured that the knowledge would not be completely lost. Isis began to work with other researchers and spiritual teachers who had also recognized the truth about the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, who understood that the suppression of this knowledge had had profound consequences for human consciousness and human civilization, who were committed to the revelation of the truth to humanity. Together, they began to decode the symbols that pointed to the location of the temple, to understand the practices that would allow them to access the knowledge preserved within it, to recognize how the truth had been hidden in plain sight within various spiritual traditions. They discovered that the Temple of the Dragon Mothers had left traces of its existence throughout human history. They discovered that certain sacred sites, certain temples, certain places of power that had been built by ancient peoples were connected to the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, were part of a network of consciousness that the Dragon Mothers had established. They discovered that the knowledge preserved in the temple had been transmitted through secret societies, through mystical traditions, through the consciousness of women and men who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. They discovered that the physical chambers of the temple contained sacred texts that encoded the knowledge of the divine feminine in symbols and metaphors. They discovered that the temple contained artifacts that had been created by the Dragon Mothers, objects that carried within them the consciousness of the divine feminine, objects that could facilitate the awakening of consciousness in those who were ready to receive them. They discovered that the temple also contained chambers that existed in dimensions of consciousness, chambers that could only be accessed through specific practices of meditation and consciousness cultivation. They discovered that these chambers contained knowledge that was far more profound than anything that could be encoded in physical texts, knowledge that could only be transmitted directly from consciousness to consciousness. knowledge that could only be received by those who had awakened to a certain level of awareness. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Isis spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, that would guide them toward the awakening of consciousness, that would allow them to access the knowledge preserved within the temple, that would help them understand that they too could become carriers of the consciousness of the Dragon Mothers. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken the consciousness that would allow them to access the Temple of the Dragon Mothers and to help others do the same. She worked with spiritual teachers from different traditions, showing them how the knowledge of the temple appeared in their own traditions, how their own traditions had preserved fragments of the ancient knowledge. She worked with women's groups, showing them how the Dragon Mothers had honored the divine feminine, how the consciousness of the Dragon Mothers was accessible to all women who were willing to undertake the journey of awakening. She worked with communities, showing them how the awakening of consciousness to the knowledge preserved in the Temple of the Dragon Mothers could create transformation in the collective consciousness, how the awakening of even a small number of beings to their full potential could create a field of consciousness that would facilitate the awakening of others. She created practices and disciplines that would help practitioners awaken the consciousness that would allow them to access the temple. She taught meditation techniques that would facilitate the perception of dimensions of consciousness that were invisible to ordinary awareness. She taught practices that would activate the dragon consciousness within practitioners. She taught the sacred geometry and the symbols that would allow practitioners to navigate the dimensions of consciousness where the temple existed. But as Isis's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within institutions of power who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers would undermine their authority and their control. There were those who had benefited from the suppression of the divine feminine, who worked desperately to prevent the awakening that Isis was facilitating. And there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Isis began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles, but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Isis understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the revelation of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers and the reason for its concealment. She understood that the temple was not hidden to keep the knowledge from humanity, but to protect it, to ensure that it would be available when humanity was ready to receive it. She understood that the Dragon Mothers had been working through the ages to guide the evolution of human consciousness, that they had preserved the knowledge in the temple as a gift to humanity, as a resource that would be available when the time came for the Great Awakening. In her final years, Isis worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered, to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for accessing the Temple of the Dragon Mothers and receiving the knowledge that it contained. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the temple, awakening the consciousness that would allow one to access it, and participating in the great work of transformation that the Dragon Mothers had been working toward through the ages. When Isis died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world. More and more people began to understand that the Temple of the Dragon Mothers existed, that it contained knowledge that could transform consciousness, that they themselves could awaken to the consciousness that would allow them to access it. And in our own time, we are witnessing the revelation of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers in unprecedented ways. We are seeing individuals awakening to the consciousness that allows them to perceive the temple. We are seeing the emergence of the knowledge that has been preserved within it. We are seeing the recognition that the Dragon Mothers have been working through the ages to guide the evolution of human consciousness. We are seeing the collapse of systems that were based on the suppression of the divine feminine. We are seeing the emergence of a new consciousness, a consciousness in which all beings recognize the sacred feminine as the primary principle from which all things emerge. Beneath the desert lies the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, a sanctuary of consciousness, a repository of knowledge, a place where the divine feminine has been preserved and honored through the ages. And now, in our time, the temple is being revealed. The knowledge it contains is being transmitted. The consciousness of the Dragon Mothers is awakening in human awareness. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you awaken to the consciousness that allows you to perceive the Temple of the Dragon Mothers? Will you open yourself to the knowledge that it contains? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of the Dragon Mothers and the sacred feminine that they have preserved? Will you participate in the transformation of human consciousness that the Dragon Mothers have been working toward through the ages? Beneath the desert lies the temple. Within the temple lies the knowledge. Within the knowledge lies the power to transform consciousness and transform the world. And you are invited to become part of this great awakening, to claim your role in the revelation of the Temple of the Dragon Mothers, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of the divine feminine that will reshape all creation. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.